You are listening to Down Home. Episode 2. In this episode, we talk to longtime friend Kevin Yarde about systemic racism here in Canada.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
Welcome to Down Home, the Nova Scotian experience from two black men. I'm Derek Wise.
I'm Jay Jones.
Jay Jones down there. And our guest today this week is Kevin Yarde, a great friend of ours, social worker, father, and lifelong Torontonian. Kevin, thanks for doing the podcast. This is awesome, man. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
And you forgot all around nice guy.
All around, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, man.
Do your research, D. Do your research.
Do your research.
I'm lacking.
I thought I said that in the brief bio. But anyways, listen. Hey, first of all, before I get into myself and introduce myself, really wanted to congratulate both of you. I've been privileged to have conversations with you guys in and around your desire to start the podcast. So good to see that it's finally here. Really excited to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And especially today, when we mark the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So cheers to that.
Cheers to that. Hello.
Cheers to that. Yeah,
in terms of me and who I am, born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, dad of Bayesian descent, mom of Jamaican descent, lived here until I was 1, then lived in Jamaica until the age of 6, then returned to Toronto, where I've been situated ever since. Grew up, really supportive parents. Really a strong sense of religion growing up, and the sense of identity and conversations around race and sort of some of the barriers that Black people, especially Black males, face. Went to university, got my master's in social work, and have been working ever since at the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, the largest child welfare organization in North America. First 18 years at CAS, I spent my time as a children's service worker, whereas working with young people who, for a variety of different reasons, were no longer living with their birth families or natural family. So they were living in foster care, or in some cases, group homes. So did that for 18 years. The last 2 years, I've been one of 6 anti-Black racism practice leads in the agency, where we're really, I think, probably for the first time, taking an intentional look at how systemic racism plays a part in terms of the outcomes for Black, racialized, and Indigenous communities. Dee, in the clip that you sent me, you were talking about systemic racism, and you sort of listed off some of the institutions that perpetuate racism, right? The police, health, criminal justice. One of the things that wasn't mentioned was child welfare. Specifically in Toronto, the Black community makes up, I think at this point, it's about 9% of the total population, but overrepresented in child welfare. 43% of the children in care are Black.
Wow.
Really, when we talk about systemic racism and the impacts of that, in terms of the work that we're doing now at the agency, is really focusing on the impacts of anti-Black racism on a systemic level and how it's impacted the community. So really happy to be doing that work.
That's awesome.
Man,
that's
that
awesome.
is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Cheers to you, man, once again.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a very important work.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important work. What attracted you to social work?
Oh man, why do you ask me that question? Listen, I'd love to say that growing up, I always knew that I was going to be sort of drawn to social work, and that's what I'd be doing, but that necessarily wasn't the case. Grew up, my parents were big fans of Perry Mason, and so from a young age, it was, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a lawyer. And so I don't know if they were disappointed when I told them I was going into social work, but I discovered social work sort of at the end of my undergrad. Right, had worked at summer camps, had really liked working with young people, at a young age, I think there was so much value in sort of the experiences of children and youth, and learned so much from them, and really enjoyed that work. I love building relationships. And so it was near the end of my undergrad that sort of social work was introduced to me, and it was that time that I'd applied to the MSW program, the 2-year MSW program at U of T, and really, when I look back, I think there's nothing else that I'd rather be doing. There's nothing else I think that would give me any greater pleasure or joy. The opportunity to work with young people who have gone through sort of traumatic experience, but still exhibit such resilience, such courage and bravery. And I've learned so much from the children and youth that I've worked with over the 18 years. And even in terms of the work that I'm doing now, in terms of the equity and ABR work, is really grounded in outcomes for the children, youth, and families we work with. That's first and foremost in everything that we do,
Right.
And that's the center of everything we do. So just really feel fortunate and privileged to be doing the work that I do.
Awesome.
That's amazing, man. It's very important work, and it sounds like you're sort of found that path that you needed to be on, and you are that type of person, knowing you for so long, that can really bring forth that change. But as far as trauma goes, like you mentioned, some of these children, obviously come from a lot of trauma. What about you, in the sense of what was it like for you growing up in Toronto yourself? Being a black. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so as part of the work that I'm doing now in terms of the equity work, we play a clip from Dr. Kevin Yarde, psychologist in the States, and he talks about sort of racial socialization and when did you sort of first think about yourself racially. So I think living in Jamaica, a homogenous society, I don't think you think about race in the same ways. But it's funny coming here, and one of the things that I remember is being placed in ESL.
Okay.
Really?
So yeah, so coming to Toronto at the age of 6, had been in school obviously in Jamaica, right, and coming here and being placed in ESL, and I think if not for my dad's advocacy, what was like a week or 10-day stint in ESL could have been a much longer stint, right? And I remember getting into fights at a very early age, being in a predominantly white school. Right. And I think you're just trying to fit in.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true.
You're just really trying to fit in. It's all about survival. So when you think about that transition, new country, new culture, race, and being othered in a way that you weren't in Jamaica, I think initially an extremely, extremely difficult transition for me. As I grew up, predominantly sort of white schools where you're really trying to fit in. And I've had conversations now looking back, I think Jay, you had said something that struck me in the clip that Dee had sent me about, when you're living it, you don't necessarily feel it or see it in the same way, but now when you reflect, you're like, oh my goodness. Right?
Yeah, it's true.
The things that I endured, the things that were said to me, and you're just trying to get along. Right. And it's an unsafe space to really advocate for yourself in the way that you would like to, in the way that you should, and you're silenced. So I think, growing up, I think I was silenced. Right? And not necessarily because of anything inherent in me as a person and my characteristics, but the space wasn't a safe space. It's
express yourself. Like how similar when you're talking about your school experience. Jay mentioned very similar experiences in having that feeling. Of being isolated, like I've talked several times about how the neighborhood I grew up in was mostly black, and I didn't feel that until actually high school. It was very strange, very strange. But so you talked a little bit about you did mention that the systemic racism hurdles that some of these at-risk youth that you've been working with. Can you be a bit more specific? What does a child in the system, what are they facing?
Yeah, you know, we do a lot of work around sort of implicit or unconscious bias, right? And so are there, 42% of Black children in care, are they there because they're really at risk and in need of protection? Or is our system sort of steeped in white supremacy and Eurocentrism? And they're there because of sort of the biases that we have as a system about Black families. So I think, when you talk about systemic racism and you think about the policies, you think about the associations that we have around the Black family, that so much of the decisions and so much of the outcomes are steeped in those associations that are linked back to colonization and enslavement. The Black community is savage or is inferior or is in need of protection. Right? And so much of the decisions are based and steeped in those biases. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we're just recreating a system that was created to maintain the dominant status quo. Right?
Very much so. Yeah,
right?
very much so. It's so ingrained.
It is so ingrained, right? And a lot of our attention has been spent, when I say we, sort of societally, at looking at sort of the police, right, and the impact that their actions have on the Black community. But other systems are compromised, right, in and maybe not in the same way. And so it's interesting, D, when I heard that list, I'm like, child welfare is a perfect example of that, about the ideal of white supremacy and Eurocentrism that had such a major impact on Indigenous and Black communities.
Yeah.
You think about residential schooling, right? You think about the impact that they had in sort of stripping Indigenous peoples of their language, of their culture. And it's the same thing that they've done to the Black community.
Definitely
Disconnecting
so.
from your community.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs when you sort of have, like you were saying earlier, like you don't really notice it because you're just really trying to survive.
Yeah.
But coming from it as a little bit older and really starting to understand how the world works, all these things have triggered something into me looking back at how I grew up. And I was like, wow, and it's almost as if sometimes I wasn't exactly myself because I was trying to be someone else. So I wouldn't be looked at as that person they didn't want to see, like, because I was Black, and that is strike 10 because there's so many different things that come from that. So it's definitely a sad state of affairs, and I can only imagine you see it more in a more intense everyday way, especially when it comes to families and how it directly affects the communities and the misrepresentation of minorities, Yeah.
And I think the thing is when we have these conversations, my colleagues at work, predominantly white, one of the things that we talk about or that we're mindful of is, you also don't want people to pity the community. True. Right? You don't want them to start thinking, oh my goodness, I feel sorry for, but instead it's about recognizing the resilience, the strength, the love, all of those positive attributes that we as Black people know that we have, and that get lost in white supremacy, that gets lost in sort of systemic institutional racism and bias, right? And so it's really about acknowledging the strength of the community. Right. And so, D, when you talk about sort of how it plays out, another example is, when a young person comes into care, we don't necessarily do a good job of searching for kin and kith. So, who are, they talk about it takes a village to raise a child, but we don't necessarily good job of as an agency of reaching out to fathers, to extended family, right? So one of the saddest things sometimes is to hear, you know, a young person has been in care for, you know, 4 or 5 years, and then you finally are able to get in touch with family members, and like, I had no idea.
Wow.
Like, if I knew this, I would have come forward a lot earlier, right?
Yeah,
So,
wow.
Yeah.
but again, it speaks to the fact that, you know, Black children, the perception or the belief that Black children are in need of support or in need of help from systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's another concept that we've been kind of kicking around when people talk of systemic racism. It's not necessarily this black hat evil thing that you know, our white friends are like, we're going to make this person downtrodden. These are things that are ingrained in the existing systems.
Yeah.
So even when, you know, these organizations, these systems are trying to help, you have to hurdle over things that have been ingrained in these systems for decades and decades and decades, right?
Yeah.
It's changing ideas and changing people's mindsets to think outside of that box that has been set up and is set in concrete.
Yeah, Dean, I think it goes to that point that you're trying to change systems that weren't created for us.
Yeah, there's
right.
that.
So in some ways, the systems are doing exactly what they were designed to do.
Yeah, true.
Control,
right?
You know,
right,
yeah,
and maintain the status quo and support the dominant group. So when you think about changing it, you're going to be met with a lot of resistance because people want to maintain power.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on is the trip that you took to Nova Scotia. I think it was 2016.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
We wanted to get your take of the Black Nova Scotian experience. Like, that's a very broad question, but you know, you can take that question however you want.
First of all, let me just stand up a little bit and just represent.
Hey, represent.
Okay, all right. You're hired.
For all of our podcast listeners out there, Kevin just showed us that he was wearing an Africville t-shirt. We'll be covering what happened in Africville in a future video.
You're hired.
Had to. My mom would be happy to know that I had to iron it out before I came on screen. Listen, I think the hardest thing for me as I reflect on the trip in 2016, and so just maybe a little context. So in the agency, you know, very early on, like 15 years ago, Black staff, along with some white staff, had sort of realized before we were talking about disproportionality, had realized and acknowledged disproportionality, and was really trying to find innovative ways in which to connect Black youth and care to their Blackness, to their heritage. So Soul Journey was designed, and it's a trip that takes, you know, anywhere from 30 to 36 Black youth in care to different parts of North America. So New York, Washington, D.C., Alabama. We've traveled to Jamaica, Detroit, Windsor, spent some time in Toronto, Buxton, and Nova Scotia, I think 3 times. So one of the interesting things for me, both during the trip and even now, 4 years later, is how disconnected I was from the Black experience in Canada. Right. And when you talk about systemic racism, you know, another one of the manifestations is education, what you learn and what is your history. So didn't really know about the Black loyalists, the Maroons who settled in Jamaica and then traveled to Sierra Leone because of the circumstances and the environment that they faced once in Nova Scotia. I didn't know about Africville. So there's this sadness that comes. Right, there's a sadness about this is Canadian history, not just the African Canadian experience, but this is Canadian history that we weren't taught.
Yeah,
and so there's a sadness about that. you know, just really, I mean, I think traveling North Preston, we were in a coach bus, and the roads were such that they're like, you know, there are certain places that you couldn't even access,
Yeah.
that you couldn't even get through out of fear that we would be stuck. You know, we were talking, and we had a tour guide, and we were talking about, well, if they have to go to the hospital or the doctor, just when you look at the infrastructure, like you couldn't believe in 2016 that this was the Black Canadian experience. And in some ways, it's extremely devastating to see what we've done to the community. But the flip side to that is, I mean, the people in Nova Scotia couldn't be any nicer. Oh my gosh. When we talk about sense of community, when we talk about connection to history, when we talk about pride, it was so evident, and people were so nice. I remember, I think when we arrived at the time, Professor Wanda Bernard, now Senator Bernard, met us at Dalhousie and spoke to the young people, right? And,
excellent.
And when I contrast that with the experience, and Jay, and we both talk about this in terms of growing up and just wanting to assimilate and not wanting to make any waves, you think about the opportunity for our kids to experience that and how different that was from our upbringing. Right. I think those are probably the things that stand out to me the most about that trip.
That's amazing. But it's sad, like I say, it's so sad that you know, the curriculum today doesn't teach that to our youth, you know, especially the Black youth. And you know, you're a grown man with a career, family man, and you just found out about it 4 years ago. You know, the history.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think a lot of Black studies have been I don't know, almost relegated to post-secondary studies. Like, and you have to choose it as an elective.
You have to choose it. Yeah,
and you have to search it out.
Yeah, you have to search it out. Yeah,
right. You have to search it out.
Yeah, it is unfortunate.
It just takes away from our identity when you really break it down and were to look at it. You'd be like, oh my God, this really breaks you down of who you really think you are, or who you need to be, like, you know.
And I think the other thing, it upholds this myth about who we are as Canadians.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. The fact that we're loving, we're accepting. Like, we've got a history steeped in colonialism and enslavement.
Oh, definitely.
And we don't acknowledge that.
No.
We don't talk about that. I think the Ontario Black History Society recently, I think, just took a history book and I think marked out in black all of the content that didn't speak specifically to the African Canadian experience. And I can't remember how many pages they were left with, but I'm not sure it would even fill a chapter.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely not. Yeah.
Right?
No, I think we get caught up in contrasting ourselves with the Americans a little too much.
Big time.
And I do it myself sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I say, well, at least this, at least that, at least this hasn't happened to me. At least that hasn't happened. But we have our own version up here.
Yeah.
For
and
sure.
If you blink, a lot of the experiences, whether it be systemic racism or outright racism, if you blink, we miss it.
Yeah.
But then it's the type of situation where you go home and you go, I don't know how I feel about the way that police officer really treated me. I don't quite, but it's so slight, and I don't know the word I'm trying to think of, but it's we do get caught up with saying, well, it's not that bad. It's not that bad.
Yeah.
It is that bad though.
Yeah, it's definitely bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not explicit in the same way that it is in the States, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because we have this appearance of being such a multicultural country kind of covers that up, and but when you really break it down, there's everything is systematically placed to just take away from any experience of feeling like a normal human being sometimes.
Yeah.
If you look at where you come from and you're not a part of the powerful majority, right? You know?
Yeah. And I don't even like, I mean, I think I just said that it's not as explicit in the States, and that
Yeah.
isn't even true, right? Because I think there are examples all the time, you know, Devontae Miller, you know, in terms of that experience in the sentencing that just took place last week. So I think it's maybe we don't want to think it's as explicit. We don't
Exactly.
want to believe that we have the same issues here. And it's easier for us to sort of deflect and say, well, we're not as bad as the States. And that gives us some I don't even know what it is. It makes us feel better about ourselves that things aren't as bad here.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the Devontae Miller case, one of the off-duty officers was actually acquitted.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
So that's not great. It's not great at all. But
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
you have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the